is automating SharePoint Online with Flow, PowerShell, Azure. So we will spend a little bit of time on all of these different areas and kind of dive into all of them, and then at the end, how you can tie them all together. Some real world examples of how I have tied them all together for clients before. But first, a little bit about me. Have any of you not been in one of my sessions yet? Okay, there's a few of you. So I can do the about me. I tell everybody with here, because it's one track, sometimes you get the same people in every session, and they're like, okay, I've heard about you 3 times now. I don't need to hear about you again. But my name is Ben Stegink. I am the owner, and for this conference, I've given myself the title of the Office 365 Ninja at my company. I work for myself. I am the company, so my title changes based on the conference and what title I feel like giving myself any given day. I also do some Office 365 training. I have been doing SharePoint for a long time, ever since SharePoint 2003. Office 365, I did a little bit with it before it was Office 365, but most of my Office 365 experience has been after they changed it from BPAWS to Office 365. I have a few different websites up there, benstegink.com, intelligink.com. That's my blog and my company. The membership site is just a free area where I have a bunch of old decks and PowerShell scripts and videos of different webinars and stuff. So if you want to go sign up and see some other presentations, download some scripts, feel free. Twitter, @BenStegink. For those of you that have been in my sessions before and heard the joke, I am the only Ben Stegink out there. So just go Google Ben Stegink and you'll find me. I own like the first 10 results on Bing and Google and all that, because there isn't another Ben Stegink. I also have a podcast, the Microsoft Cloud IT Pro podcast. Myself and Scott, right down here, if you've heard any of his sessions, do that together, where we talk all about Office 365, Azure, from an IT Pro point of view. So yeah, take a listen. We come out with one a week. We actually released one this morning. Got a couple interviews too while we were down here with some people. So yeah, that's me. As we go too, feel free to interrupt, ask questions. If I'm not looking at you, throw something at me or just yell at me. I'm not opposed to being interrupted and answering questions as we go. So a little about this session. We'll start off with introduction to Flow. How many people have used Flow or seen Flow? Okay, so about half of you have some familiarity with it. Have you guys built many flows, just kind of looked at it, but not really used it a whole lot? Built a couple flows, okay. And then Azure Automation, we'll take a look at that. If you guys were in my reporting session yesterday, we talked about Azure Automation as well. As I was going through this, I was like, I almost should have had Matt flip these around or something so I could do Azure Automation yesterday, because we'll go into some of those basics of creating it. Today, how do you get started with that? Has anybody here used Azure Automation? So that'll be, Matt has, Matt doesn't count. So it'll be new, and Scott, you don't count either. So that'll be new for most of you. And then kind of connecting Azure Automation to SharePoint Online and how you can kind of bring it all together at the end. Use Azure Automation, use Flow, use SharePoint, and tie them all together to create various automations, workflows, those types of things within SharePoint. And then finally, that, again, those real world examples that we'll get into at the end. So to start with, an introduction to Flow. So first of all, what is Flow? For those of you that have not used it before, Microsoft would tell you it's not really an upgrade to SharePoint Workflow. It's kind of the next iteration, their next workflow product. It does a lot more than SharePoint Workflows. How many people have used SharePoint Designer, done SharePoint Workflows, Visual Studio Workflows? Okay, so a fair amount of you. Flow, in my opinion, takes it to a whole nother level. SharePoint, you really were tied to SharePoint or using some type of REST services. You could do some things with webhooks. You could get creative with Visual Studio. Flow has a lot of the SharePoint activities in terms of dealing with lists, libraries, documents, files, approval workflows, those types of things. But it also lets you go beyond just SharePoint, tie it into things like Twitter, tied into various Azure services, tied into Facebook. There are hundreds of services, even outside of the Microsoft ecosystem, that you can tie Flow into to automate different tasks. One example, I actually have a SharePoint list where I put some tweets in it, and I have a flow that goes through and runs every once in a while, looks at that list, looks at how long it's been since I tweeted, grabs a tweet out of the SharePoint list and throws it out on Twitter. So sometimes I'm not even tweeting. Flow and SharePoint are doing it for me. How to get started with it, there's a couple different options. So how many of you have used Zapier? Does anybody use Zapier? Nobody? All right. Well, if you have used it, Flow is similar to that, where you can start from a blank slate. They also have some templates out there. So if you kind of want to get an idea of how some of these can be wired up, you can go out and search for different templates, what other people have done to integrate SharePoint and Twitter, or Facebook and Teams, or I think you can tie into Google Sheets with it, and SharePoint. There's a whole bunch of integrations, a whole bunch of templates out there you can start with, or you can just go out there and say, hey, I want to start with a completely blank slate. You define, in Flow, you define a trigger, and then from that trigger, a whole bunch of actions that occur after that trigger takes place. So maybe it's updating a list item in SharePoint, creating a new list item as somebody tweets with a certain hashtag, something to trigger that flow to start, and then the actions that take place after it. The other thing that does come into account with Flow is service accounts. So naturally, for all these services, you have to be able to connect to them. You're not going to go connect anonymously to your SharePoint environment or to a Google Sheet. So when you go and set up these different connections with the actions, and we'll walk through kind of what this looks like and what you can do with it, but you have to have an account to connect to it. Some people, their tendency will be, oh, I have my account, I'm going to go in and connect with my account. The problem is now you're connected with your account. If that flow is set up so other people are able to run it, maybe it's triggered off, again, some item being added to a SharePoint list. That flow will then run as that service account you set up, even though they triggered it. So anything that flow does, say for example, you add an item to a SharePoint list and it goes and creates an item in some other SharePoint list. That will be created as the account that you set up to connect to SharePoint in that action. So I really encourage you, if you're going to do Flow, and as you start creating those different connections to various services, make sure you use a service account so that it's not tied to a particular individual. If that person leaves, the connection will break. For auditing purposes, it would show up as taking place as that person. So take advantage of service accounts with Flow. And then, again, watch out for those service accounts. The other thing with Flow is it tends to be a little bit more of it's tied to a person, not necessarily the organization. So you have to watch out for, Scott went out and created the Flow the other day. Now Scott leaves the company. This flow is still only owned by Scott. There's not a good way for me to go in and retake ownership of it. It was his flow, he created it. So make sure that you take that into consideration. You can also create infinite loops in Flow. So watch out for that. One of the triggers is, again, a SharePoint list. If a new item is added or edited, go do these actions. Well, if one of your actions is to edit that same list that triggered it, all of a sudden, you create a new item, your flow edits it, it triggers the flow, it edits it, and you're stuck in a loop. You can stop it, but there's not like a checkbox you can say where don't go restart it. You have to put some condition then at the very beginning of your flow that says either look at a SharePoint field that you update, and if this field got switched from yes to no, don't rerun the flow. Or one thing I like to do is use that service account, and if the edit is made by the service account, then don't run the flow. Again, it prevents it from running duplicate times. It will run twice. It runs the initial time, does all the stuff. It runs the second time, looks for that condition at the very beginning, says, oh, it was edited by the service account, jump out of the flow, and then it won't run it again. One other thing I did want to mention with Flow is, yes?
You said the person who creates the flow is the owner.
Yes.
And is there a way to transfer that ownership of the flow? Like, say if the person leaves and now you need somebody else to service that?
There is, and I'll show that when I jump into the demos too, but you can add, if you add a secondary owner, third owner, fourth owner, it turns it into a team flow. And then if that person leaves or that account's disabled, it still stays as that team flow. And you can associate additional users or additional groups as an owner. The other thing you can do with Flow, and it's in the notes too when we get into the logic apps versus Flow, is you can actually add a resource owner to a Flow. So now instead of an owner in there, you go in and add like it sounds kind of goofy, but you add a SharePoint list as an owner of the Flow. And now owners of the SharePoint list now inherently own the Flow because that list is the owner of the Flow along with the people. It's a little goofy and I can show it to you. It's been out for a little while and I just discovered it actually today when I was playing around with some stuff. One other thing to think about, and some of the companies I've worked with have gone the way of logic apps. So there is also logic apps in Azure. So you have your Office 365 flows, you have logic apps in Azure. Under the covers, they are the same service. You can actually take flows and move them into logic apps in Azure. There are some differences there. Logic apps tend to be more organizational. So they're in Azure, they're tied to a resource group, it's a resource in Azure. It's not that association with a single person. The downside is you have to have an Azure subscription, you have to have permission to go in then, create the logic apps in Azure. The interface to create them is similar, but some of what you can do and what's available does differ between the two. Some companies prefer to do logic apps if it's going to be something organizational wide and leave the flows for more power users because of that whole ownership of flows versus logic apps. So there are also on the flip side, there are some things you can do in logic apps that you can't do in Flow. It tends to be a little bit more developer-y in logic apps. So just be aware of those two, take a look at those two. Pricing also is different. For instance, Flow is free. You get 2,000 runs per user per month with Flow. Those runs are pooled. So if you have 5 users, your 5 users have 2,000 runs per month, you have 10,000 runs across the organization. One person can use all 10,000 of those. One person can use 100, the other person the rest of them. So it's not that it gets cut off based on who owns the flow and if they've used their 2,000. It's that pooled runs across the whole organization. And again, it's included. Once you get into logic apps, you are going to pay per action. You pay for various connections. It is very, very cheap. The price per action is, I figured it out. I lost track of the zeros after the decimal point. I think it's like 25 10,000ths of a cent. Yeah, per action. There's some good blog articles out there. I can send you to one or two if you want to look at some examples of how the pricing works. It is not going to be a significant investment to run logic apps instead of Flow, but the investment is there and some of that additional overhead of getting the Azure subscription stood up. So going into creating these flows and how you do it. So if you are in your Office 365 environment and you get access denied, you broke it, Scott. There you go. You have your Flow icon under Apps. If you don't see it there, you can go to All Apps and you can search for it here, and there's Flow right there. Once you go into Flow, you'll see you have My Flows. You have team flows, and then you have the business process flows. We're going to focus on my flows, team flows. It's really easy to go up here, create a new one, and here's those two options we talked about before, where we can create from blank, or we can create, from a template. We'll just start with a template, and there's a ton of them out here. You can go look through all the examples. Associated to weather, Power Apps button, save Outlook email attachments to your OneDrive, updates from a blog post, so from the RSS feed from the Flow blog. If you're looking for one, you can go out here and search for, let's go find something related to Twitter. Save tweets that include a specific hashtag to a SharePoint list. And you can go browse through all of these. Once you click on one, it will give you a little more information about it. Here it tells you what it's going to connect to. I already have connections set up in mine. So this one, in this case, is connecting as me. I have a couple of my Office 365 connections in here, or I can go add a new connection, sign in. This might automatically log me in. Nope, it's going to let me pick. So I could go in here, add another account that I have. Grab the password because I don't know any of my passwords anymore. And create that connection. It'll go out, and then that connection will show up here in the list of available connections. So now it's using PowerShell. I can go switch back to one of my accounts. And then the same type of thing with Twitter. We're going to let me sign into Twitter. And I forgot I have MFA on this account. I'll see pictures in my text messages. Oh, I lost my authentication window. Submit, authorize the app to actually connect to Twitter. And once I have those two connections, it'll let me continue. And now that I'm in Flow, I can go in and say when, say, Live 360 is tweeted, for example, we want to go add it to, it'll pop up with a list of some of the sites. If you have more than one, you would get more than one there. You can also enter a custom value. So if your SharePoint site doesn't show up in that list, you just select enter a custom value, and it'll actually let you go type it in. Just select this one. I have a whole bunch of lists out here. I don't really want it to add it to any of them. I'll just pick one as an example. And once you pick that, it'll actually show you. So I picked a list where I stored some servers and IP addresses. It gives you those list of fields that are in SharePoint. So at that point in time, it's just clicking in and adding the information into these flows. So if I want to do IP address, you'll see here's all the information it got from Twitter that I can put in that field. So if I wanted to know when it was created, the location, and then here, if you did want to, you can just do free text too. You can type in anything you want to. Hit save, and that flow will now be out there, running, working. And you'll be able to see a run history here. If you want to change that ownership and make it so it's no longer associated with just me, you can go in here and add another owner. And this is where, again, you can go type in another name. Sure, make them an owner of it. And now I have multiple owners. So if I leave, if my account gets removed as an owner, it gets blocked. Aaron's, in this case, would also be an owner on it. So he would have the ability to control it. This is where you can actually set that ownership to a SharePoint site. So in here, because I'm connected to SharePoint, I can say my SharePoint site owns it. The list, the my servers list that this is connected to is also an owner. And then go in and add that SharePoint list as an owner to that flow. So now as you add people to that list, as people have permission to that list, they also have permission to the flow. And you'll see that flow moved out from being underneath my flows now to being underneath team flows because it has multiple owners on it. If you're going to create a blank one, it is, I clicked that too fast. You have the option up here to create from blank. It will also give you some options here. So when an email arrives, when an item is created in a SharePoint list, Twitter, we can just go in and create from blank, and you can just go out and start searching for Google connection or connections. So we can use Gmail. When a new item arrives in Gmail, we can sign in, and then we can just go through and start adding additional steps to it. So there's conditions in there. This is where if you were editing a list item, you may want to put a condition in there of, was this last modified by the service account? And then put everything under yes, and then no. It would just go through no and exit out of the flow if it was modified by the service account. And just go through and start building in those different actions. Send you notifications, create contacts in Outlook, add as attachments from SharePoint, work with your OneDrive files, and any number of other connections you may want to do. There is one caveat here. There are standard and premium connections. So in the free plan, you don't get all of the premium connections. You can pay, upgrade your flow plan, and then get additional connections to some of these premium services. Adobe is in here, Salesforce, there's some DocuSign stuff, MailChimp. So that, again, just an introduction, how you would go start building out that flow, what it would look like. You can do whole sessions, classes just on flow. But that is that general overall introduction. You also do one other thing. You do have connectors over here. So you can just go create connectors this way, browse through them. It does denote which ones are premium and which ones are not. So that is flow. Getting started with flow. The next one we are going to dive into is our Azure Automation. Play from the current slide. So Azure Automation is the next puzzle piece that I use when I start looking at building out automation in SharePoint. It especially complements certain things that may be missing in Flow. And as we get in and start putting this together, I'll talk about some of those things why you may want to use Azure Automation and where that should tie in. But first of all, what is it? So someone asked me the other day why they called it Azure Automation and not just PowerShell for the cloud. Because what I use it for is just running PowerShell in the cloud. It can be used for a lot more, even outside of Office 365. There's functionality built in there for managing servers, managing patching on servers, a whole plethora of things. You don't have to run just PowerShell. You can run Python scripts in it. Azure Automation is a lot more than just PowerShell in the cloud for Office 365. In this scenario, that's just what I use it for. So one of the problems I quickly ran into with Office 365, as you can see, I'm on a Mac. I can't run PowerShell against SharePoint Online Office 365 yet, or at least not against all of it yet. So I had to go into a Windows 10 VM. Another thing you run into is I have clients that are all in Azure. Maybe they want to run some PowerShell. You don't want to spin up a server just to run PowerShell against Office 365. You don't want to have a Windows 10 machine running or have your laptop running all the time whenever you want to run maybe a long running script against SharePoint Online. So you can start doing it in Azure Automation. I'll go in and show you how you can go in and start writing that. But Azure Automation lets you author an entire PowerShell script. You can use variables, you can use modules, and you can then schedule that PowerShell or use different services or different actions to actually trigger the running of those PowerShell scripts in Azure Automation. Again, why should you use it? It prevents you from having to do it on a server. It's significantly cheaper, too, than doing it on a server. Going into what does it cost? Azure Automation in is free for the first 500 minutes the PowerShell script is running. So if you have a script that runs for 2 minutes, you can run it 250 times in a month and not pay a dime. Once you hit your 500 minutes of running scripts in a month, it is 0.2 cents per minute after that. So again, it's really cheap. I had one client that was looking to run a script that I think we figured it was actually going to take like 20-ish hours or so, once a month or once every couple weeks. Even if they hit their 500 minutes per month, I think they were only paying like $14 a month to be able to run that script for that long every couple weeks. You really aren't going to pay a lot of money. Most of your scripts do not run for that amount of time. By and large, I do not run any scripts that run up against that 500 minutes per month. Again, the features that you have in there, you do have the ability to schedule scripts. So if you want a script to run once every hour, if you want it to run once a day, if you're in my reporting session the other day, I have used it to write scripts that go gather a bunch of information from Office 365, SharePoint Exchange, store it in a database, so I can build reports about what's going on in my Office 365 environment. I use Azure Automation. I schedule it to run once a day, go collect all the data, shove it off to a SQL database. You also have variables. So if you have information you want to share or store in there, maybe it's the client secret to use app authentication to get to Office 365. Maybe it's just a URL for your root SharePoint site or your admin SharePoint site. You can store those in the variables. You also can store credentials and certificates in Azure Automation to use those to authenticate to your Office 365 environment. And then you do have source control. So you can actually tie GitHub or what is now DevOps into Azure Automation. So you can version all of your scripts, store them in source control, sync them into Azure Automation, and run them that way. Again, tying into a little bit, if you were there for the panel, when they were talking about kind of how IT is changing, you're going to have to understand some of those development concepts as you get into some of this IT pro world, especially in Office 365. That's where some of that comes in. I have found myself over the last couple of years learning more about source control as I'm writing all these scripts, how to version them, how to store them in source control, how to sync that source control with these services that I may use as an IT pro. And then finally, running scripts. You can run them manually. You can just go in, click run, let it run. Again, you can schedule it. You can tie it to webhooks. What we'll get into later, you can actually trigger PowerShell scripts in Azure Automation from Microsoft Flow. So lots of options there in terms of how you even want to trigger those scripts and run them. It still gives you all the output, the warnings, the errors. Everything is there in Azure Automation. And then, again, words of caution about Azure Automation. Scripts can take a little bit longer to run. You're running them off in the cloud. They don't always run as quick as they may on a Windows machine. You can run into some of those long-running scripts. Microsoft wants to make sure that you don't consume all the resources or that your script is caught in some type of loop. If it runs too long or if it uses too many resources, they will automatically kill your script. PowerShell or Azure Automation does support PowerShell workflow where you can store the state of your script and write those scripts as workflows. And that's actually what I had to do with that longer running, the 20, 30-hour scripts, because you can usually get about 90 minutes to 2 hours before they kill it, where you have to set essentially checkpoints in your script. So once they kill it, your script can then go back in, pick up where it left off, and keep running. It definitely gets a little bit trickier when you get into long-running scripts, but it's something to be aware of as you write those scripts, that those longer running scripts, you're going to have to start looking at writing PowerShell workflows, not just a normal PowerShell script. The language, the syntax is all very similar. It just adds a couple new commandlets in it, and a couple of things you have to think about in order to save that state to pick back up where you left off. So now we'll dive into a little bit of Azure Automation. How do you even get started with it? I know this was a question too that came up yesterday. So if you had that question and I kind of glossed over it really quick yesterday, we'll spend a little bit more time looking at how you even get started with it. So I'll go into my Azure portal and log back in as me. So in Azure, I added it to my favorites. So I have my Azure Automation accounts, right down here. If you don't have it down there, or you don't even have an Azure Automation account created yet, you can go look in all services, look for automation in here. Did you spell it right? And there it'll show up as your automation accounts. So don't search for Azure Automation. I've made that mistake before. A lot of this stuff gets labeled as Azure Automation. Azure VMs like Azure Active Directory is actually Azure Active Directory. Just search for automation. Once you're in your Azure Automation accounts, you can create a new one here. You can also create one from up here by just clicking on Create a Resource. And again here, searching for automation. Automation. And create automation right here. So I'm going to start from this one. And we'll go in and add a new Azure Automation account. The name we'll give it, we'll just make this one our Live 360 account. Here you get to pick a subscription. I have a whole bunch of them. Some of mine are MSDN. I do have some pay-as-you-go ones. This is what it may look like if you have an enterprise agreement or you bought it from a CSP. But pick that account you want to use. Even though it's free, you still have to have it tied to an account. So you may have to go create an account, put in your credit card number, and then to use Azure Automation, just be careful you don't go spin up like one of those virtual machines that'll charge you $6,000 a month on your credit card. You can't put in that limit and say, hey, don't charge my credit card at all. I just want to use the free stuff. So you do have to be a little cognizant of that. But once you pick your subscription, I'm going to pick one that I have some resource groups in. The next thing you do is pick a resource group. Think of a resource group as just a group of all the resources in Azure. So maybe it's Azure Automation accounts. Maybe you have these Azure Automation accounts that if you were doing stuff with virtual machines, use with the virtual machine, you can bundle all those resources together in a resource group. One for organization, some of it's for security management. Some of it can be for deleting everything once you're done. So I can go actually wipe out my demos resource group. And if there's anything in there I'm paying for, it all goes away. The location you want it in. I do East US for a lot of mine. I'm in Florida. I keep all my stuff on the East Coast. But there are locations for other countries. Other locations in the US. West US is in here, I think. Canada, North Europe. Once you have that, you just click Create. This will go out and start spinning up a new Azure Automation account that you can start creating those runbooks and PowerShell scripts in. And we'll see how quick it goes. We'll let that go, and I'm just going to jump into one of my other ones that I already have. So once you are in your Azure Automation account, overview is just going to give you some of that general information about it, jobs you may have, subscription ID, location, activity log, tell you what's going on. Again, just an audit log of all that activity within your Azure Automation account. If you do need to go in and assign permissions, you do have your access control, so you can assign people different permissions, let them into your Azure Automation account. The rest of this stuff we will skip over. All of the PowerShell scripts are in these runbooks. Down here at the bottom. Can everybody see this okay? Is it okay in the back? Let me know if I need to zoom in more. I can even make this a little bigger. There we go. Down here is the runbook. So if you click on runbooks, you can see I already have a bunch of them created in here. You can browse the gallery for additional runbooks. So just like with the flows, you do have a gallery of runbooks people have created. I actually don't know if there's anything, I think there is some related to SharePoint. More starting and stopping VMs based on a list in SharePoint, updating SharePoint list items. So there's a couple in here already for SharePoint. Most of mine, I tend to go with just adding a runbook. Here, give it a name. So maybe this one is just get my SharePoint sites. We'll make it a PowerShell runbook. Create it, and it'll go off and create that runbook. This is where I can just start writing PowerShell now. There is no IntelliSense, no IntelliType, whatever that Intella term is for devs, or those of you writing PowerShell. So if I go in and start typing like get SPO site and hit tab, it just starts tabbing. It's not going to auto-complete it for me. I have to know what that command is. Same thing with any of the parameters for URL. It's not going to work. So this works for minor edits. If I'm writing a larger script, I tend to still write them out in Visual Studio Code and then just copy and paste them in here, test them in Visual Studio Code. There's only a couple minor differences between what you would write in Azure Automation and what you would write in Visual Studio Code, and it primarily revolves around getting credentials or getting variables that aren't right within your PowerShell script. Once you have that script written, you will, well, we'll go back into edit. You will notice I have a test pane up here. So once it's written, I can just go in and test it. I can click start. Over here, it'll show all the output from that PowerShell script, and I can see what's going on. Once it's done, I'll publish it even though it's blank. I now have that option here just to start that runbook. That'll go start that PowerShell script, run through it all. Once it's running, even though it's blank, never tried to run a blank one before. This will give you all that input. So if you had parameters in your runbook, what input you had, what output you had, any other logs, errors. So you can go through and see if there was actually an error in your PowerShell script. Yeah? It does count against your minutes. This is the one time when I have hit 500 minutes. If I'm writing like a bigger script that maybe takes 4 or 5 minutes to run, and I'm doing a bunch of testing in Azure Automation instead of just testing it in Visual Studio Code, then it's like I run it for 5 minutes, I make a small tweak, I run it again for 5 minutes, and it can add up. That's another reason I'll test a lot of it outside of Azure Automation and then just copy and paste it in and just use this for really minor tweaks. It's also a lot quicker to test outside of Azure Automation. Because the way it works, you click start and it actually like queues it up. And then you have to wait for it to get out of the queue and start running. And by and large, it just runs slower in Azure Automation than it would if it was on your computer. And then as it runs, you also have a history of your jobs. So this is all the runbooks that ran in my farm. So you can see some provisioning ones here, some of them completed. I stopped some of them. This one just failed because it had nothing in it. And that's where if you go in, it doesn't even have an error because there was nothing in it. So you'll get that whole history of those PowerShell scripts and when they ran, what their outcome was. There was something else I was going to say. Now I'm drawing a blank. Runbook galleries. Oh, schedules. If you wanted to schedule one, let's go back in and look at our runbooks. We'll just use our get SP sites. You also have this schedule up here. And this really is just click through, create a new schedule, give it a name, when it starts, the time you want it to start, if you do want it to recur, how often it should keep going, and it'll just start going on that schedule. So nice GUI interface, go through and create your schedules. I think that is all the high points. If you do anything with webhooks, I try to avoid webhooks because I don't like developing, and webhooks get a little bit too close to development for me. But you can trigger these from webhooks if you have some of that developer background and want to work with webhooks. Any questions at how to get started with Azure Automation, high level of the Azure Automation stuff? I'm going to go in a little bit to how you tie this into SharePoint, because there's a few more things you have to do with SharePoint that I'll talk about here in a minute. All right, so integrating it into SharePoint. So at this point in time, we've just kind of created that, we've created that Azure Automation account. We have the ability to run PowerShell scripts, but if you guys have done it before on your local machine, you'll know you can't just go in and start running scripts against Office 365. You have to have modules installed, you have to get credentials, you have to do all of those types of things. So the modules you need to get started, in my opinion, with SharePoint is you need the SharePoint Online one. This is the out-of-the-box module from Microsoft for SharePoint Online. This one has more of the management type commandlets in it, managing sites, managing SharePoint as a whole, not so much working with lists, working with libraries, working with items in a list. For that one, you're actually going to need the third one down there, the PowerShell PNP. It's a community project, but that has, and in my opinion, is significantly more useful for writing PowerShell scripts against SharePoint Online. And then the other one is Azure AD if you want to get users, if you want to work with licensing in PowerShell. I know someone in my session yesterday sent me a question about licensing with PowerShell, and I can show that script. And if you're here, I will send you that script too. And if any of you guys want it, feel free to let me know. I'm happy to send you scripts if I don't have them out there already. And then you need credentials. So one thing about Azure Automation and Office 365, SharePoint, is there is no support for MFA. So if you have MFA enabled for all your users, you're going to have at least one account that doesn't have MFA enabled. Hopefully, if you're using Office 365, you already have that, especially considering what's gone on with Azure AD and MFA over the last month. I don't know if any of you guys were hit with that. Yeah. There's one person nodding their head. Did you have an account that didn't have MFA enabled on it?
No, it was worse. We did, and we couldn't get in.
Oh, no.
And we were sitting in a meeting with Microsoft, going through some things, and couldn't answer questions.
So there were, I can't remember, was it 2 or 3 times, Scott, in the last month? 3 times in the last month, MFA quit working in Office 365. Yeah, not that we're counting or anything. And if you had MFA enabled, you could not get into your tenant because it just didn't work. So you either had to go in with an account that had MFA disabled and disable it for all of your users so they could get in, which then meant after it started working again, you had to go in and re-enable it for all your users. Again, you decide what's the lesser of 2 evils. Either way, you should always have at least one account in Office 365 that has MFA disabled on it. The other way you can do it is you can use, especially with the PNP commandlets, you can use like an app ID or secret to connect to Office 365, or you can even use a certificate. And you can leverage both of those with Azure Automation, so that gets around the MFA account. Again, I still recommend having an account without MFA enabled. Yeah? If MFA, so is it with the new baseline security policy? Yeah, so what I do is I just go in and set one user on that policy that's excluded from MFA. So they rolled that out, and then they had all the MFA outages where they rolled it out, it got turned in by default, it said, hey, all your admins, turn on MFA. And then MFA went out, and none of your admins could get into Office 365. It's an interesting few days. So yeah, in that case, I go in and set one user as being excluded from that baseline policy so that that alarm and that doesn't force that one admin account to have MFA enabled. I should have deleted this slide. I don't even know what I was going to talk about. So,
It's a good thing you're not on video.
yeah, it's a good thing this isn't being recorded and I'm not on video in this. Yeah, I'm just going to skip this slide. We'll get right into the demo. So the demo of connecting Azure Automation to SharePoint. So now that we had that Azure Automation account, it can't connect to SharePoint. So the first thing we're going to do is go look for those modules that we talked about. So this is not in a runbook. It's at that automation account as a whole. And I'm going to go into the new one I created for Live 360, because that doesn't have any of them enabled. And go down here to modules. So in here, these are the modules that are already installed in your Azure Automation account by default. So you can see it's a lot of the Azure ones. There is nothing here for SharePoint. These modules, or this ties right into the PowerShell gallery, PS gallery, where all of those different modules are actually stored that you can go install. So right up here, I have that option to browse the gallery, and Microsoft did us a big favor and put the SharePoint Online PowerShell in the gallery maybe a month or two ago. You used to have to do a whole bunch of hacks to get this into Azure Automation because it was still an installable MSI. Now you can just click on it. We can import that one. And you just go through and import all of those. So the SharePoint PNP, this is the SharePoint PNP module that we can import. And we could go out here and search for Azure AD. We could grab the Azure AD or the Azure AD preview. I always tend to just use Azure AD preview. There are a few other ones out there. If you're working with other services, Microsoft Teams has a module out there too you can install if you're doing some scripting against Teams, provisioning Teams. So we can go add a bunch of those modules into your tenant or into your account. Now that those are in there and you go back and look at the modules, they might not be installed. So like the SharePoint PNP one is importing. So this adds all of those modules in and gives you the ability to use the commandlets in these modules in your runbooks. You still don't get any of the type ahead and teletype, but now it wouldn't throw an error when you start using those modules. The next thing I always do is go in here to credentials, right underneath modules, and add a credential. For me, I actually have a PowerShell account, so you can do PowerShell admin, type in the username, type in the password. I have no idea what it is, so I'm just going to make something up for this one. And click create, and it'll go out and create that credential. If you do want to use something like the app ID and secret, you do have that option too to do variables, where maybe it's a string that you want to add, different integers, Boolean values. Any of those, you could put a client ID or a client secret in one of those. You can use certificates if you're going to do the certificate authentication. But from there, now you have all you need to go in and connect to SharePoint. So if you would go in now to your runbooks, got to keep an eye on my time. Add a runbook, create a new one, get SP sites, do another PowerShell one. Create it. You could do something like connect to PNP online, give it the URL. And if we need the credentials, so we'll just do credentials. If we would pass in a credential variable, we can go grab that credential variable now from Azure Automation by going down here and looking under assets. And we have those variables, connections, certificates, credentials. Here's that PowerShell admin we created, and add it to the canvas. And every once in a while it does that, or it formats it goofy. It should be that. So now what we're all doing is getting that Azure Automation PowerShell credential, give it the name, and then using that credential to connect to our SharePoint Online environment. If you're going to use an app ID and secret, one of the scripts we'll look at later, I'm actually using that app ID and secret to connect to SharePoint Online. But from that point in time, you can just go on and write your script. You'll go in and connect. Exchange Online is a little goofy because it's a remote connection to Exchange Online. It does still work, and I have some example scripts if you want them of connecting to Exchange Online as well, if you're going to run some of this against Exchange Online. Oh, one other thing I was going to show you. You also can do parameters with PowerShell. And because I can never remember the syntax, and I'm not about to type it out, I'm going to go grab one of my other ones that has some parameters in it. Azure Automation. Or I'll just show you one that has parameters in it. That would be even easier. This licensing one just has a couple in it. So if we go in and look at this runbook, right at the top, you can add parameters in just like you would a PowerShell script. So parameters, if that parameter is mandatory, what it is, the value of it. So this one, I just have a couple of them. I defaulted usage location to US. This is one of those scripts that I actually use for licensing, where it would go through and license users based on a default set of licenses that we set. So one of these, if you actually go to run them, because it has parameters in it, it will prompt you right over here. So in this case, isn't the username to log in, but it's the username of who you'd want to set those licenses against. So you could do new user at intelligent.com. The usage location was US. If it was any of the other locations, this would be used to set that usage location for the license. So that's how you would enable parameters, and you can actually pass parameters into your Azure Automation account or into your runbook as well. And that will come into play in a little bit. So now that we have looked at, first was flow. How do you create flows? We looked at Azure Automation, creating the runbooks, or creating the Azure Automation account, creating runbooks, adding parameters so you can pass parameters into your Azure Automation. How do you put it all together? What are some of those real world examples? What does this look like once you combine everything together? My most common use for this is actually provisioning. It's one of my favorite examples. It's one of my favorite everyday use cases. If you come from a SharePoint world, I came from a SharePoint world. I went into one client. This is my favorite one. I went into one client who wanted me to help him with a SharePoint migration. I sat down with them. I'm like, okay, so how many sites do you guys have? What are we even looking at migrating? They're like, I think we have maybe 500 or 600 sites that need to be migrated. It's like, okay, let's find out. I wrote, you can find out with about one line of PowerShell how many sites are in a SharePoint farm. They had 6,000 SharePoint sites in their farm, and they had absolutely no idea. I have seen sprawl in SharePoint when you allow anybody to create a site. I really like going into my clients and saying, not we're going to take away the ability to create sites from everybody, but we're going to put a little bit of a gate in front of their ability to create sites, at least make them fill out some information so I have a list of all the sites that get created. Maybe you put approval on it, maybe you don't. But at the end of the day, at least I have a SharePoint list of all of my sites. I do this with provisioning. This also helps if you have a default set of content types you want on every site. you can set up views. If you have a default set of sites and a default set of views that you want in all the different libraries, if you want additional lists or document libraries created. Some of this stuff you can do with the site scripting as well. I still do it all in PowerShell because that's what I know. One of these days I'm going to figure out the whole site scripting and JSON and all of that. But I do it all with PowerShell, and I'll tie it all together with Flow, with Azure Automation. The one we'll look at, you can even, I let the users pick. Do you want an Office 365 group with a SharePoint site, or do you want a team associated with that Office 365 group? So that's the one we'll look at. You can use it for updating sites and libraries. The other advantage of provisioning is now if every site gets provisioned the same way and goes through the same process, I know what all those sites are like. I know what content types are associated. Maybe I know how they're categorized. I can then go through and make updates to sites and libraries. Maybe I need a modification to a default view on all of my IT sites, or maybe I need this one content type added to all of my document libraries and my legal site. I can do that. For a while, we were using a list to provision OneDrive for Business and licensing users. They didn't want to give everybody in the organization rights to Azure Active Directory to go in and assign licenses, or to even modify what licenses users got. So we created that simple list with that script I was showing you earlier, where anybody in IT could go in and enter a username and their location, and then it would go through and set the default set of licenses for anybody that got added to this list. Some of this was a little bit more applicable before group-based licensing became available to everybody. But maybe in some of your cases, that's what you want to do. You want to be able to track that a little bit more. You're not going to use group-based licensing. You just want a list, and you enter someone in a list, and they get that default set of licenses. There's a bunch of examples you can continue to come up with about what types of things you may want to automate in SharePoint or even across your entire Office 365 environment. So in the last 15 minutes or so, maybe 10 if you guys have questions, I'll go ahead and show you what this looks like. It's not what I wanted when you tie it all together. So I will get my sites to start coming back up. We're going to start in Flow, and I'm going to show you one of my runbooks that I have out here. So another one I have out here is my provisioning one. This is my provisioning for an Office 365 group. And in here, I've taken a whole bunch of different parameters around the display name, the alias of the group, access type, public or private group, if there's a secondary owner, Boolean, which is set as a string in here for if they want to create a team, if they want it to be visible in the address book, external email. It goes in, creates that connection to Exchange Online, goes in here and gets, this is where I get the client ID and secret, or get the client secret from a variable, and then pass it in right here when I connect to PNP Online. And then here I go out and create a new unified group. If they wanted a friendly alias, here's the version of it if they just want the default alias. This looks at if they wanted a team or not. If they don't want a team, if they do want a team, I go down here and connect to teams and create them a new team. Otherwise, I create them a group. I make sure that group is created, and then I go in and adjust some of the permissions on it. Set up some of the secondary owners, set up some of the member groups. Down here, if they did choose a friendly alias, I go in and set the SMTP address of the group. So if they want a friendly or email address, I set that. And then I go set some of those properties around if anybody can email that group, external or internal, if they want it to show up in the address book. So set some of those properties that get passed in as those variables. So that's just a high level of the script. Once we go in then to, now we're going to go back to Flow. And first I'm going to show you really quick what happens when, how you would tie that in a blank one. And then I'll go show you one that I've actually built out and how it all works. So in this, we just say maybe it was when a new SharePoint item is created. Imagine we filled that out. And the new steps here, one of those actions you can choose from, is right here you have Azure Automation. So if I select Azure Automation, my options are create a job, get the output of the job. So if you are sending out some output and you want to see if it failed or not, you can get the output, or get the status of a job. Is that PowerShell script still running or not? For provisioning, we're going to say we create a job. And now you go through and you have to pick where it is, which means I have to remember what account it's on. So it's first the subscription. This is that resource group. The automation accounts, this is my demo group. And then it'll give me all those runbooks names. Mine was this provision the Office 365 group. And it actually automatically goes in and looks at all those parameters and says, here's all the parameters. You get to put the values in Flow. So again, these could be things you type in or you dynamically pull. And we'll go look at the flow in just a minute where I have it all entered. And then up here, if you want to wait for the job to run or not. So if you're going to make some updates as part, or if you're going to use the group later in the flow and you want for that group to be fully created, this PowerShell script to run, you're going to want to set this to yes so that flow doesn't proceed beyond this step in the workflow until that job that you created is done running. And then you can go do a whole bunch of other stuff. So if you take this and expand it out a lot more, I already have a SharePoint list. I'm going to go create a request, and we can actually walk through it being created as well. So sites. Huh? Oh, thanks. Might actually be Teams demo too. Nope, there it is. So I created out here a Teams and Groups provisioning list. So here's a bunch of tests I did before we started today. If I go into here and click New, I customized this a little bit with Power Apps because I wanted to do a few things. One, the URL of the group. I don't want them to be able to set the URL. One thing I do is I have a list that has a number in it. Every time I create a site, it pulls from that number, increments the list. All of my sites are intelligent.sharepoint.com/teams/team, and then a number, project, a number based on the type of site. One of my preferences is to do that because how often has a department changed and the URL no longer makes sense because you used what the department was when you created the site. I keep the URLs very generic and use the display name to denote what it is. Most people bookmark it, they search for the name. Most people are not going in and typing the full URL of the site every time they go to it. So in this case, we'll do our demo site. And this is just a title for the list. That title doesn't get used anywhere. For our display name, we'll do the Live 360 Awesome Demo. If we want a friendlier alias, maybe this is just Live 360 Awesome. Access type, if it's public or a private group. And we'll make this one a public group. If you do want a secondary owner, it's just a lookup field to Active Directory. If you want to be able to associate these with departments. So the nice thing is this is not only a list where they can go in and request a site, but it's a list where you can track everything. So if you'd want to see all of the sites created for the Human Resources Department, you could go in and filter the SharePoint list down by just sites for the Human Resources Department or just sites for the IT department. Maybe Human Resources needs a team site, and then just some check boxes if you want, or toggle switches if you want to include teams, if you want to allow external people to email the 365 group, or if you want it visible in your global address book. Once that's done, we will click Save. and jump over to, here's Flow, to my flows. And here's that workflow. You can see we have one that's running already from the list item I just submitted. So we're going to look at this. I have when an item is created, and it gives me all the inputs, and here's all the outputs. So here's everything I entered in around the access type, the display name, secondary owners, all of that information. And then that I immediately followed by start and approval. I have this set to go to me. You could have it set to go to a manager, to an IT department, to multiple people. So over here, I got an email that told me I have a new group approval request for the Live 360 Awesome demo. Do I want to approve it? Do I want to reject it? Here's the link to that list item if I want to view all the information they put in. I trust them. I'm going to go in and approve it and submit it. And you'll see that picked up the approval. It said I approved it. From here, I go down and I initialize that prefix variable, and then I go get the URL. So this is going out to a SharePoint list that I have in that same demo site that apparently I've lost already. Site/demo, let's go view all the site content. And I just created a group provisioning configuration list where I have the site number and the value of 109. So it went out, it grabbed all of that, looked at this condition here and said, looked at my condition, said yes, it was approved. So I go out and I get the site number. So I hard-coded in there, hey, go to this list, go grab this group provisioning config, grab list item ID of 1, which I know is that number. Take that number, so it gets the site number, creates that group alias. So it looked and saw that, hey, I selected this to be a team site. I got the number. I want this to be 109. And then it goes out here and it creates the job. So here it's passing in all those parameters, the friendly name, the owner who I set to be the creator of the list item. It grabs secondary owners. I said create the team false. So if we jump over to our Azure Automation runbooks now, okay, and our demo sites runbooks, and our Provisioner Office 365 group, here's that job that's running. So this is the one that just triggered. If I go look at my running job now, I can look at my inputs. Here's those same inputs. So here's everything I just passed in. My output, you can see it already created the group. Right now it's in that state where it's waiting for that group to create to make sure it gets created. If I did have any errors, those would also show up down here. All logs, that typical warning you get when you connect to Exchange Online. And hopefully, yeah, so there, again, it segregates the warnings when it looks at that entire log. Hopefully this will finish here quick. So once it's finished, which it usually only takes a couple minutes, it's grayed out, but I send the person that created that list item, so whoever requested that group, I send them an email. You can customize it, put the link in there to their SharePoint site for their group. I go ahead and update that group number, so the next request will get 1010 instead of 1009. And then I actually go in, and there it goes. And then I update that site request list with the new URL. So this goes in, re-updates everything. So if I would go back now to my group and team provisioning list, you'll see my demo site, my awesome demo. I actually added that group URL right up here to that read-only field. So now if you need to go back, you want to see the URL of what was created. Again, you want that record of truth for all my HR departments. You have that URL, you have that entire list now of your SharePoint sites. And even though it created it, it says it's not there yet. Seriously? It was going so well. Let's go look at my admin center and see if it showed up. Because the other place it'll show up then is in your, should be there in my SharePoint admin center to prove to you that it actually went out. Have you guys played with a new SharePoint admin center yet? It is so much nicer than the old one for viewing all those sites. Created newer to older. So here it is. It is showing up here. Oh, it grabbed the wrong URL though. I had something goofy in my code. So, in theory, that should have created that as the alias. Oh, I think I know what I did. I tweaked something in it right before. The thing you're not supposed to do, right? Change your script right before your demo. I changed one of my variables in SharePoint. So instead of taking the alias, it took the friendly alias. You can see the one right, oh, the ones right before it did that too. Here's one that worked. So I do know what I did. I can fix it and send you the script if you want the script. But that's how I go through and automate it all. Again, lots of scenarios where you can do licensing, you can do updates to SharePoint sites. But this is one of those examples of, again, not all of that functionality to work with teams to modify group settings and all of that is actually there in Flow. But you can do it all with PowerShell. So if you can do it all with PowerShell, just write a flow, call your automation runbook, and then write all your automation in PowerShell. One other one that I did find out, I have 3 minutes, I'll describe it, I won't show it to you, is if you start playing with Flow and you want to copy list values from one list to another list, maybe you have a draft list and it copies it to a publish list. One of the things that is not supported yet in Flow is copying values for a multi-value field. So if in your SharePoint list you can select multiple departments, maybe it's multiple people, any of those options where you have a multi-value field, you can't, it doesn't actually show up in Flow to work with it to copy it. That's another example where I actually wrote an Azure Automation runbook. I said, okay, go take this list item, copy it to this list. Now go run this runbook after that list item has been copied. Go grab the multi-value field from this list and copy it over to this list just using PowerShell. Again, another one of those where it just gives you that added flexibility to automate some things, to fill in for something that may be missing in Flow, and tie your Flow automation with your PowerShell all together to create those solutions to help you manage your Office 365, SharePoint Online, whatever environment in Office 365 it may be. And with that, I am done. There's still 2 minutes. If you have questions, email address, Twitter, feel free to reach out to me. I have cards and stickers up here if you want them. I forgot to set them out. Fill out the surveys. It helps the conference. It helps us, me, all the speakers know what we can do better next time. And enjoy the rest of your conference. If you're staying tomorrow, enjoy your workshop tomorrow. If you're headed home, thanks for joining us this year down in Orlando. And hopefully I'll be back and you'll be back next year and we'll come up with more fun SharePoint Office 365 stuff to talk about. So thanks again. Enjoy the rest of your day.